This lecture will serve as an introduction to Mahayana Buddhism, subtitled The Way of the Bodhisattva. The objectives of this lesson is for you to be able to identify characteristic features of Mahayana Buddhism, such as the doctrine of skillful means and the many bodhisattvas and celestial Buddhas that are part of the Mahayana universe, and geographically where is Mahayana Buddhism the majority religion. You should also be able to explain the relationship between Punya, or merit, and Buddhist super beings, and how such beings as Amitabha and Guanyin are significant. Third, you should be able to articulate something about Mahayana metaphysics, which is explanations of the structure of reality. Okay, so metaphysical concepts such as sunyata, which we'll talk about in the lecture, as well as the three bodies of the Buddha. How many bodies? 3. So Mahayana is the majority religion, or at least among the most important and influential of religions in China, in Korea, and in Japan, and also in Southeast Asia, which is for the most part Theravada. Vietnam has both Theravada as well as Mahayana influence, but demographers of religion believe that Mahayana is more influential than Theravada within Vietnam itself. Now, China, we've talked about, actually has 3 influential religions and philosophical systems. These are Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and we'll talk more about Taoism and Confucianism very soon. Also through the influence of communism as a political system in China, all religious systems have been downplayed and sometimes forbidden, yet Buddhism has had a revival along with aspects of Confucianism and Taoism, and indeed some values of these traditional systems were taken into and accommodated within the communist revolution in the 1950s and 1960s. In Korea, in which Buddhism has been very influential, also has a strong Christian mission, and Koreans, although still very much a minority, many Koreans have converted to Christianity to some degree, and we're talking about South Korea here. Although Mahayana Buddhism continues to be the most important. In Japan itself, we see a dynamic of both Mahayana Buddhism as well as Shintoism. We don't include Shintoism within this War Religions survey, but there's an excellent chapter in your textbook on it, and you can read more about it on your own if you so please. So Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana, you can see the words Maha there, along with Yana. So Maha, we've seen in the words, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, the great soul, right? Maha, Atman, the great soul or great person. We've seen it in the Mahabharata, right? The great epic about the doings of certain kingdoms and kings and avatars in the world, in which the Bhagavad Gita is a much smaller book within a larger epic. So Maha, the great, Yana, vehicle, or the greater vehicle, greater than what? Well, there is another popular form of Buddhism 2,000 years ago in which Mahayana was becoming a distinctive form of Buddhism, and this other form of Buddhism was called, well, they didn't call themselves this, but this is what the Mahayana people called them. Called it Hinayana, which means the lesser vehicle or the smaller vehicle. And sometimes this is confused with Theravada Buddhism, yet most Buddhist scholars today don't believe that Hinayana and Theravada Buddhism are one and the same thing. Perhaps both Mahayana and Theravada have roots in this branch of Buddhism that, for lack of a better name, might be called Hinayana, this traditional form of Buddhism. But Theravada is not Hinayana. So Mahayanas believe that this form of Buddhism, of Mahayana, is this big car that has all the apps and all the gadgets and gizmos needed and all the space needed, all the teachings, in other words, all the Dharma or teachings needed to bring in anyone and everyone into the path of enlightenment, of awakening, and desist from the cycle of rebirth and re-death in this world of samsara. They also believe the way of Mahayana is a selfless path. Even while you're in a way seeking your own enlightenment, you're doing it through helping others also seek enlightenment and a removal of suffering in others. And they distinguish this from their own representation of Hinayana, right? Whether Hinayana really saw themselves as being this way, probably not. But they present this older form of Buddhism as very self-seeking. They were an arhat, someone who's following the Buddhist path and trying to become enlightened by it, is seeking their own removal of suffering rather than trying to help others do the same, right? So they very much distinguished Mahayana as a selfless path. Whether it's indeed all that much selfless than what Hinayana was is anyone's best guess now. The grand majority of Buddhists in the world follow a Mahayana system. Theravada is also very influential in Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, but it's numerically wise, it's the minority branch of Buddhism. So we've already looked at the map. We've seen in China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Chinese Malaysia. And then I include things like Mongolia, Tibet, Nepal. Now, these would be included in Mahayana Buddhism sometimes, because sometimes of Vajrayana Buddhism, which we'll look at very soon, or sometimes called Tibetan Buddhism. This is sometimes seen as a sub-branch of Mahayana Buddhism. Other scholars consider it a unique branch of Buddhism all of its own, or a third large branch of Buddhism. So depending on the count, places like Mongolia, Tibet, Nepal may or may not be considered strong Mahayana Buddhist countries. But Taiwan, which is a country that is ethnically Chinese, very much has Mahayana Buddhism as well. A central doctrine of Mahayana Buddhism is skillful means. We'll look at what that looks like in a second. And the ideal path to follow is the way of the bodhisattva, which is this supreme ideal of selflessness. And we'll look at what that means in a second. And through the doctrine of skillful means, lots of scriptures called sutras, sometimes pronounced suttas in other dialects, were written and developed, believed to be traditional teachings, more esoterically or secretly passed down from one generation to the next, that have links with the teachings of the Buddha himself. But these many teachings, these scriptures that were written down, are believed to offer a pathway towards enlightenment, towards many people, different propensities and dispositions, all giving them a pathway or vehicle towards enlightenment. So what is this doctrine of skillful means? The doctrine of skillful means is linked with the Lotus Sutra, in which there is the parable of the burning house. The Lotus Sutra says other things, but this is the very famous story within this longer sutra. In this sutra, a father wakes up to find that his house is burning down, and he's trying to get everyone to safety. He sends his servants out. He sends his wife out, and then he's searching for the children. The children are all busily engaged in playing with their toys in a room of the house, and the father tries to get their attention and send them out, and they're too busy playing with their toys to give their father much much heed at all, much attention at all, and finally the father trying to figure out how he can save his children from these burning houses. There's too many of them, and they're too heavy for him to gather them all about in his own arms. He finally says, "Come outside with me, children. I have the most wonderful toys with you outside. I have a cart with each with an animal to lead that cart, and each of you will have your own cart. One of you will have an ox pulling your cart, another one will have a goat pulling the cart, another one will have deer pulling the cart." Right there, there's these most wonderful carts for you to play with outside. Come with me outside, and I'll give you these carts. And the children leave the house and the burning house and go outside and find that, oh, actually there's no carts with animals, wonderful animals leading them at all. But they look back and see the house burned to smithereens, and they're just glad to be free of this burning house. So in this parable, of course, the burning house is this world of samsara, in which there is misery and agony and suffering, rather than peacefulness and equanimity and happiness being the characterizing experience. And the story, or the offer the father gives of these carts, wonderful animals, are skillful means, or teachings that can lead the follower of the Mahayana path towards freedom from samsara, from this burning house. And even though any of these teachings aren't the exact nature of reality, because reality cannot be really described, it has to be experienced directly, still, like the raft that leads you across the river, once you use these teachings, you can experience reality for itself, and you no longer need any sort of teachings of the sutras. But those teachings of the sutras are needed to actually lead you out of the house, but they can be disposed with once you get out of there. So the ideal of skillful means represents that there are different teachings of Buddhism and different ways and practices of Buddhism in accordance to the different levels and readiness of the audience. So it wasn't so much that the story of the cart and the goat and ox was a lie, but it was what the children needed to get their attention and get out of the burning house. So it was helpful to them, right? For other members of the house, servants and his wife, being able to describe and see the nature of the burning house, and there's freedom outside, right? This more direct guidance of what's going on. These other members of his family were ready to know that, and they could see reality a little bit closer to what was really going on, rather than needing these different teachings, but different strokes for different folks, different needs for different people to get their attention and to lead them out of the burning house of misery and agony of samsara. The doctrine of skillful means is focused on the idea that there is in this world among human beings universal capacity for Buddhahood. So everyone is a baby Buddha or a Buddha in the making. And different teachings might be needed for different ones of us to get our attentions and to lead our way of spiritual progress. But it's a matter of just these teachings waking us up to our true reality as Buddhas, or at least Buddhas in the making, baby Buddhas, or each of us having the seed of Buddhahood, and just needing to wake up to our true reality of awakened, enlightened beings. Someone who wants to follow the Mahayana path will take the bodhisattva vow, or commitment. Let's look at what that bodhisattva vow is. So, the bodhisattva vow represents this statement. Sentient beings, okay, so thinking, feeling beings are infinite in number. I vow to save them all. right? So we see this selfless impetus of Mahayana Buddhism from the very beginning in this bodhisattva vow. Okay, vow to save. It's not about saving yourself. I vow to save all sentient beings. Not so much focused on myself, but perhaps I will be enlightened and awakened in the process of trying to save all sentient beings. So their infinite number, I vow to save them all. The obstructive passions are endless in number. I vow to end them all. What's going on with these obstructive passions? These are different attachments and passions, sensual and passions and greed and desire for power and desire for prestige and desire for wealth and symbolic capital of such, whether it's developing your CV as a lawyer or as an academic, your CV or resume. Right? The obstructive passions are endless in number. I vow to end them all. The teachings for saving others are countless. So think of Skillful Means. The teachings for saving others are countless. There's many different strokes for different folks that can help them grow and develop. They're countless. I vow to learn them all. I'm going to learn all the different forms of medicine. I'm going to be the best sort of physician that can give precisely the medicine needed for each and every person that to heal their sickness and liberate them from this burning house of samsara. Buddhahood is the supreme achievement. I vow to attain it. Right? It's within the context of this whole bodhisattva vow that by attaining one's own Buddhahood, one can help save everyone else from the suffering, anguish of this life, and how to deal with these anguishes and miseries in this life in a productive, healthy manner. But Buddhahood is also linked right with this universal capacity for Buddhahood. I vow to attain what is my true reality and my true capacity. So each and every person, whether they're a monk or nun or just a lay person, in other words, a householder or family person or bachelor or bachelorette, but who wants to be married someday, right? Each and every one of these people take this bodhisattva vow and try to make it as their ideal way to live their life as a Mahayana Buddhist. So let's look at this other central idea of the bodhisattva. Okay, so one takes this vow to try to be this wonderful bodhisattva. Bodhisattva literally means enlightenment being. So a bodhisattva is different from a Buddha per se. A bodhisattva is someone who has, for the most part, attained enlightenment. It has not gone into parinirvana, right? This supreme end nirvana, which one becomes completely detached and free from the concerns of this life and world. Rather, a bodhisattva is someone who, in their great compassion and empathy, is still linked with this world, and whether they have a physical body or they have died and their consciousness remains in the universe in some way, they continue to devote themselves to the freeing from suffering of all beings in this world. So this other meaning of the bodhisattva is a future Buddha. Within Theravada Buddhism, within Theravada, right, the way of the elders, it is this other main branch of Buddhism. A bodhisattva is usually thought of as someone like Siddhartha Gautama, right, the one who became known as the Buddha 2,500 years ago. Just before he attained enlightenment, he was a bodhisattva. He was one at the brink of supreme enlightenment. And at that moment, he was a bodhisattva. In other words, an almost Buddha before he became the Buddha himself. So a bodhisattva is dedicated to liberating others from suffering. Okay, whether you're a monastic, monk or nun, or laity, someone who marries or potentially is going to get married, they all take this vow to try to be a bodhisattva. Bodhisattvas within the Mahayana system or branch are also beings of superpower who help everyone. Okay, so these are beings sometimes with physical bodies in this world, more often are beings somehow in the realm of the invisible or spiritual or heaven in some way, who don't strictly have a physical body, but who can intervene and perhaps take a physical body at different times as needed to continue their work in this world to help everyone attain freedom from suffering. However, the ideal of the bodhisattva does also occur in Theravada, not just in the almost Buddha Siddhartha Gautama just before enlightenment, but also beings who are devoted to liberating others from suffering and are at the brink of enlightenment. Within the Mahayana Buddhist system itself, it is said that those who go into parinirvana and completely free themselves from any concerns in this world, this is more of an arhat or selfish pursuit of enlightenment. Rather, the way to do things is to continue to seek the liberation of all beings from suffering, helping others grow in the path of enlightenment. And only when all sentient beings, okay, all thinking, feeling beings, are at the brink or threshold of enlightenment will everyone walk through that door together and enter parinirvana together. You can't have anyone truly free from suffering unless all are being liberated from suffering together, right? This is very interdependent, this very collective vision of the path of enlightenment. And we're all going to go together, or none of us are going to go at all. So only at the end of history, at the end of the ages, might this happen all together. A central idea within Mahayana Buddhism is that of Punya, usually translated as merit. Okay, so think of a merit badge, right, where you've been recognized for certain attainments and skills you've developed, right? So Punya is that spiritual virtue and power accumulated. It's accumulated through good deeds, thoughts, and words from practicing the Mahayana Buddhist path. This accumulation of spiritual virtue and power follows us or stays with us through our different rebirths, redeaths. So each of us can develop merit or punya, this spiritual power and virtue. Bodhisattvas themselves, these enlightenment beings on the brink of full Buddhahood, have attained a magnificent amount of spiritual virtue and power, so much they can use it to intervene in this life. Whether they have a physical body, they can do more than the ordinary person with physical limitations can do to teach others and do kind things to others and intervene with those in suffering and anguish, whether physical or psychological. And then these bodhisattvas, once they have died and no longer have a physical body, if they choose not to be reborn in this world, they can continue nonetheless to intervene in this world for those who call out to them and help them along the path towards Buddhahood. A way that us regular people, Mahayana Buddhists, can develop more punya besides good thoughts, good words, good deeds, is transferring our punya to others. Okay? So the notion is that when one is about to do something good for others, or an act of service, or an act of goodwill for others, that one dedicates that punya one would develop through that act. You dedicate it to someone else, some other friend or loved one or even stranger. And in your purity, goodwill, and loving kindness, that good act and the merit or punya acquired through it is transferred to the other. But a accompanying consequence is that you still attain the punya that you would have had you not dedicated to others. And in fact, that punya is doubled because you don't just, or even multiplied because you're not doing this act for your own punya, but for that of others. Okay, so you still have to have this sincere mindset of dedicating to others, but an accompanying consequence is that it doubles or even multiplies the punya that you would have attained if you had not dedicated that punya to others. So this is something that's called punya transference or punya dedication. There are certain beings that have been recognized in the Mahayana system for having developed an enormous amount of punya and being able to use the spiritual power to help all beings in this world to liberate themselves. And these beings, such as Quanyin, I'm about to talk about, are become super beings or supernatural beings, and in many ways serves a similar purpose as God or gods and goddesses in other religions, in which instead of a self-reliance focus has a other being, a super being sort of focus, that through the power and grace and goodness of these divine beings, one can move along the path of salvation and spiritual development and or enlightenment in the Buddhist sense. So it modifies or mitigates to some degree the self-reliance impetus that seems to be at the foundational beginnings of Buddhism. So let's look at one of these beings, Guanyin, who is known as Kannon in Japan. She, Guanyin, is the most famous among all the bodhisattvas, and if you go to a Mahayana Buddhist temple, you'll see statues and statuettes of her all over the place usually. Guanyin embodies mercy, grace, and compassion, right? She's just full of loving kindness and compassion for everyone and wants to liberate everyone from suffering. This is her great concern, and she's constantly going at it, helping everyone attain this. Now, interestingly, Guanyin, who is called Avalokitesvara within the beginnings of Mahayana Buddhism in India, was actually a male or masculine sort of being. Avalokitesvara literally means looks down with the eye of compassion. But when this being moved east from India, he became a she and given more and more feminine attributes, perhaps because these qualities of mercy, grace, compassion, tenderness, right? These are often more inherently associated with the feminine gender, and perhaps through this development, he became a she. It also might be that there was already a deity, a non-Buddhist per se deity within China, in which Avalokitesvara became linked with as having similar qualities, and the iconography of this original deity of the subcontinent became that iconography of Avalokitesvara. In other words, the appearance of Avalokitesvara now took on the appearance of this more traditional deity. The Dalai Lama, for Tibetan Buddhists, is considered an embodiment or emanation or incarnation of Avalokitesvara. Okay, so in this sense, he remains a he, and the Dalai Lama has always been, in his 500-year history, a he within the system. Although perhaps the Dalai Lama will be a she in his next or her next incarnation. So while Avalokitesvara means the Lord who looks down with the eye of compassion, or just literally the Lord who looks down, but the implications is with the eye of compassion, the name Guanyin is often translated as she who hears the cries of everyone. She who hears the cries of everyone, so the suffering, the misery. everyone and wants to intervene and liberate themselves from their anguish and misery. And the implicit idea is even before they cry. So her compassion, empathy is so great even before one has reached the climax of that misery, so that one is crying out. She's already perceived that misery and is ready and active and intervening to free us from that misery and suffering. There are various stories about who this bodhisattva, Guanyin, was in this world. Right? Guanyin is now seen as this being in the sky who can intervene at any time, anywhere, at any place, and see and hear the cries of everyone even before they cry. But who was this person in this world? Well, one of the most famous stories about the origins of Guanyin is a legend of a woman named Mao Shan. So the story of Mao Shan, and in this story, Mao Shan was a being who had accumulated a great deal of punya through her many previous lifetimes, was born as a very pure, loving, compassionate person, a daughter of a king and queen, so a princess. But unfortunately, she was born as a daughter of a very cruel and selfish king and queen. A ends justify the means, do anything to attain power and to accumulate more and more. And this king was very much at odds with his very pure heart, selfless daughter, and through scolding and reprimanding and punishing her, he did his best to make her more like himself and his wife, ruthless and hard-hearted, but she did not waver her goodness and characteristics. Finally, he exiles her to the most desolate monastery in the land, up in the mountains, where it's very rocky and cold, and she lives as a nun in that monastery, and despite its horrible conditions, she gardens and is able to make vegetables and beautiful flowers grow all around the monastery, and all her fellow nuns are quite beholden and taken by her, and the king realizes he hasn't really punished her and sent her away in the way that he wants. So finally he hires, somewhat like in the story of Snow White, he hires one of his servants to go and assassinate her, and so the assassin goes, but similarly the assassin is also taken by her purity and goodness, and it tells her what he has been sent to do, and she said, well, if that's my father's will, you must follow his orders and kill me, and he refuses, and instead takes her out into even further in the wilderness where she can be and hide in relative safety. Now it comes upon the king soon thereafter that he is struck with a great illness, and his royal doctor is unable to cure him. He sends for the other best doctors around, and none of them can figure out a cure, and he's becoming weaker and weaker by the day. Finally, he finds a doctor who claims to have a remedy, and this doctor says there's only one thing that can cure you. You must make a potion from the arms and eyes of a completely pure and good being. But you can't just take this from anyone. Such a person must freely give his or her arms and eyes to you for this potion to work. And the king is completely dismayed by this and thinking, oh, who in the world would do this for me, and me cruel and selfish. And And the doctor says, I think I know. I think I know someone who might do this if we ask. And he is able to track down Mao Shan in her wilderness retreat, and she hears of her father's plight and does indeed offer her arms and eyes to be chopped off and out and be used to be made this potion. So she actually follows the doctor back, and this potion is made. The king drinks the potion. He's of course miraculously cured. And when he's wondering who in the world did this for him, who he can thank, he's reintroduced to his daughter. There's a reconciliation. His heart just melts with tenderness and grief and regret. And he begins to become a much better, kinder, compassionate king, reflecting the attributes and qualities of his daughter much more through this. Now, Mao Shan, because of her completely selfless life, her complete life devoted to the good and well-being of others, who had already developed a great deal of merit or punya through many different lifetimes. After she's reconciled with her father, a cloud descends upon her, and when the cloud has lifted, they see that she has brand new eyes where her old eyes had been plucked out, and instead of just the two arms, she has many different arms, right? You can see iconography of this. She has many different arms to replace just the two arms she had before, and it said that these new eyes are such eyes that gives her a certain omniscience, able to see the hurt and misery of everyone and anyone around her, and with her many arms is able to intervene, just as, right, Hindu gods and goddesses are sometimes depicted with multiple arms to show their superpower. She's able to intervene all at once to help the miseries and anguish of many different beings in many places at different times. So it's said that this legend of Mao Shan is the roots of Guanyin, and she became Guanyin when she died, and is dwelling between earth and heaven and able to help everyone at the same time. Within the Japanese context, Guanyin is especially seen as a sort of patron goddess or super being of children, as well as pregnant women and women in childbirth or in labor, and she's able to help and protect children, as well as protect women in labor to have a successful childbirth, and she's also the usually considered the patron goddess of aborted fetuses, and abortion is fairly prevalent in many parts of the world, including and very much so in Japan, and the statues of her are in Buddhist temples, which have the remains of aborted fetuses, and sometimes not remains, but just potential name of that aborted fetus. Another famous bodhisattva or Buddha within the Mahayana system, as well as the Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhist system, is named Tara. According to myth, Tara is actually born out of a tear of Avalokitesvara, that in his looking down with the eye of compassion for the misery, and his crying and his sympathy with the miseries of other people, he cries a tear, and out of that tear is born this powerful spiritual being named that's often called Tara. She exemplifies or embodies the myriad or many different virtues and characteristics and powers of the Buddha in a feminine form. And her iconography is given different colors, and each color represents a different virtue or power of the Buddha. So this in meditation is often used as a way to contemplate the different attributes or virtues of the Buddha, so that one can hone in on one and understand that one thing much more deeply than trying to comprehend the almost unfathomability of the Buddha with so many different virtues and powers. Right? You just focus, take one thing at a time. So in her green, as green Tara, she represents enlightened activity, an activity of the Buddha. And as white Tara, she represents the compassion as well as healing which the Buddha gives. As red Tara, she is assertive, or assertively, sometimes it's called aggressively, drawing all good. So she's actively drawing all good to herself so that she can help relieve the misery of all beings at once. Black represents the power, the efficacy to be able to do anything and everything all at once, and have the great power that the Buddha has. Right? So black Tara. And yellow Tara represents wealth and prosperity. Okay, that's the abundance of spiritual virtues, but perhaps also seen as being able to relieve the suffering of poverty of other beings. Blue Tara is the transmutation of anger. So using anger, or transforming in a way so that it becomes an effective power for good, of addressing injustices, addressing misery, of intervening for the disadvantaged and downtrodden in this world, rather than an anger that consumes one and destroys a person. In Mahayana Buddhism, generally Mahayana Buddhism, she's considered a bodhisattva, but she's actually called just a Buddha within Tibetan or Vajrayana Buddhism. So let's look at some pictures. There's green Tara, there's white Tara, and there's red Tara. Another one of these very famous super beings within Mahayana Buddhism is Amitabha Buddha. In the Sanskrit, he's called Amitabha. In Chinese Buddhism, he's referred to Āmítuófó. And in Japanese Buddhism, he's called Amida Buddha. Okay, so this person is a Buddha, whether there's any sort of real distinguishing characteristics that make a bodhisattva different from a celestial Buddha within the Mahayana system. Well, if we want to get real technical, there might be some distinguishing characteristics, but for the purposes of this basic introduction to Buddhism, they work pretty much the same as bodhisattvas, but even though they might be called a Buddha. So according to the legend, Amitabha was a great king who had lived many lifetimes, and like Mao Shan in the legend before, had attained a great deal of merit or punya, and he was full of loving kindness, compassion, similar to Mao Shan, and he was hence very much distressed for the great suffering that existed throughout the world, and he saw people as too distracted in worldly and trivial pursuits to really be able to develop the Buddhist mindset and Buddhist practice to be able to attain nirvana in this life. So he decided to use his great merit or punya to mentally generate and create a special land called the Pure Land, or sometimes called the Western Pure Land, that anyone who with a sincere heart who called out to him and desired to be born to this Pure Land could indeed be born to this Western Pure Land. And this Western Pure Land would be a place where one could be free from the preoccupations and trivial pursuits of this world of samsara. And even though it's not nirvana itself, in that place he could teach the Dharma, or teach the Buddhist teachings to the people that are born in there, and they could practice these teachings and really develop their meditational practice, and assist one another to really develop spiritually, so that from being in this Pure Land for a certain period, one could readily be born out of that Pure Land at the end of the age to be able to attain complete nirvana at this end of this period. Okay, so Amitabha is one of the most famous popular celestial beings within the Mahayana system. For many people consider, yes, it is too difficult to really spiritually progress in this life, but if I call out to him with a pure heart, maybe I can be born in this world into the Pure Land instead of returning to this world, and attain nirvana through the development that can take place in the Pure Land. For those who focus on Amitabha Buddha or Āmítuófó or Amida Buddha, there's also a sense to try to see, as Amitabha saw, this world, this everyday world we live in, as a potentially a paradise or Pure Land, in which through this vision in this world itself, we can make it a Pure Land, which we can focus on the practices and teachings and attitudes of Buddhism to be able to become ready for enlightenment once we die from this world. Okay, so there's that potential to make an effective practice in this world, not just a sort of prayer crying out that the amazing grace and power of Amitabha can help us in our liberation. Finally, we'll talk about a fourth celestial being within the Mahayana universe. This is Maitreya, or called Metteya Buddha, and his name literally means loving kindness, whereas I forgot to mention Amitabha means the Buddha of infinite or supreme light. Okay. Maitreya Buddha is the Buddha of loving kindness. He's also called Bùdài within the Chinese language. He's called Hotei within the Japanese language, and please excuse my pronunciation for all of these, for those who really speak these languages, but Di-lặc in the Vietnamese language. This Buddha is considered currently a bodhisattva, but who is the future Buddha, right? According to Mahayanas, there's been dozens and perhaps hundreds of Buddhas that have been born in this world in the past, right? The Siddhartha Gautama was the latest of these Buddhas, just like in Jainism, right? Mahavira, we hear that Maha again. Mahavira was the latest Tirthankara, or forward crosser, to be born in this world and to teach the Jain way, right? The Siddhartha Gautama was the latest and greatest, but in the future there's going to be a bodhisattva who is in the celestial realm, waiting to be born in this world when the world really needs it, to return us to the true path of righteousness and goodness and loving kindness and enlightenment activity that can really transform this world and all ourselves together into Buddhas. So he resides in this Tusita, or divine heaven, waiting his rebirth in this world. This future Buddha. Okay, so called Bùdài or Hotei in Chinese and Japanese. Okay, he's linked with a monk who had this name, Bùdài, who was considered to have lived in the 10th century China, this monk became known as the Laughing Buddha. This monk is something of a Santa Claus like character, very very happy and jolly, and with a big belly and sort of cuddly sort of person. But he was very poor and would just walk around with his robe and prayer beads and begging bowl. But he also had a bag, and he was followed around by adoring children who he'd give little candy and gifts, simple ones from what he could get and afford. Right, so being a source of joy, being a source of kindness, alleviating the sufferings of others, he's linked with this sort of great monk who was a bodhisattva who then died and might be reborn as the Maitreya Buddha in the future. So he's going to help make earth a paradise, and doubts, cravings, and passions, and will lead the holy life of oneness. Or all people will lead the holy life of oneness under Maitreya's guidance. Help people enter trances, okay, to develop their own meditational practice, and have an abundance of joy and happiness within the world. This is the Maitreya Buddha. As an important sub-branch of Mahayana Buddhism is called Nichiren Buddhism. Partly has importance because they have a very missionary or very active proselytization process and goals into the contemporary time. Nichiren Buddhism is linked with a Buddhist monk and teacher said to have lived in Japan in the 13th century. And this monk named Nichiren believed that this was an age of great moral decay that he was living in, and great skillful means were needed to rectify this moral decay. And he believed that the most powerful skillful means of all, and the one scripture that best represented all skillful means itself, is the Lotus Sutra. And he taught that Buddhists should dedicate themselves especially to the chanting of the Lotus Sutra, and all other sutras and scriptures were inferior compared to the Lotus Sutra, and all other practices were inferior compared to this one practice of learning about, of meditating upon, and chanting aloud the Lotus Sutra, including its name, and this path develops a special mantra dedicated to devoting oneself to the Lotus Sutra. So in words that are kind of a combination of Sanskrit, Chinese, and Japanese, one will chant out loud these words, Namu-myoho Renge Kyo. Okay, so this means devotion to the supreme and wonderful law of the Buddha on the Lotus Flower Sutra. So dedicating oneself, thinking about all the wonderful teachings and laws as represented in this sutra, this Lotus Flower Sutra, and through this mantra, it becomes something like which represents nothing in particular, or no word in particular, but represents all significance and meanings in the world. Right? This recitation of this short words is kind of a point of concentration to meditate upon all the meanings within the Lotus Sutra itself. So one will find Nichiren Buddhists gathered together, or sometimes just individually, chanting aloud these words, Namu-myoho Renge Kyo, Namu-myoho Renge Kyo, Namu-myoho Renge Kyo, Namu-myoho Renge Kyo. Okay, you get the idea. So like other Mahayana Buddhists, they see everyone as potentially Buddha, and the chanting of this mantra, as well as the more generally the Lotus Sutra, can best help bring out or actualize this potential Buddhahood. One of the most famous sub branches or sects that developed out of Nichiren Buddhism is called Soka Gakkai International, sometimes referred to as just SGI for short. Okay, it was born out of the Nichiren movement and is very active in Japan today, and they're very active not just in social activism but political activism as well. And sometimes you'll see them similar to Jehovah Witness Christians or Mormon Christians going door to door, but usually within Japan itself, teaching the Nichiren Buddhist way. Their goal is to transform human consciousness to create a peaceful world, and of course this practice is a central practice to transform human consciousness. They chant the Daimoku, or the Namu-myoho Renge Kyo. They study the Lotus Sutra. They apply values. They believe there's universal values that should be emphasized, that people of many different religious and cultural backgrounds all similarly have, but the big problem in the world is the lack of applying these values to our lives, to our political and social systems, to our economic system. They practice social activism and are engaged in different socioeconomic and political projects to try to help the world. And their goal is to develop the limitless potential for courage, hope, and altruism that we all have. They're very missionary, very propagation oriented in sharing their teachings, as I mentioned. Finally, let's look at a couple of the central concepts towards the metaphysics within the Mahayana Buddhist universe. The first and one of the most important concepts is sunyata. Okay. Sunyata is linked to the idea of dependent arising, right? That there's no central essence or core of anything, and there's no central source of everything. Everything is a conglomeration or composite reality, right? So to try to say something is truly this or that, it's impossible to say that. Okay, so similarly linked to the five skandhas or aggregates, right? We're all just a conglomeration of these sorts of things. This is our identity. We don't have any sort of core, soul, or essence that makes us as us per se. We'll look at why that is. All right, so with this, no self or an atman, right? These are all related concepts, but the way sunyata has been translated is with the word emptiness, okay? That each thing is empty, okay? So it doesn't have any sort of real specific core essence to it that you can think about it, okay? A way that some Mahayana Buddhist teachers talk about it is expansive space and an approach of softness, non-attachment, non-grasping to the world around us, okay? And meditating upon the Heart Sutra, which talks a lot about sunyata, is a good way to develop a consciousness of sunyata. So a way that we can put this all together and think about it is that someone who sees the world as sunyata pushes against trying to or looking at the world in a way that's firm, okay, that's unchanging, and that it is as you think it is. Okay, that this is this and this is that, and this has this characteristics and that has that characteristics, and this is all about that, and oh, I know you, I met you before, I know what you're all about, and you have these characteristics, and this is who you are, rather than having this sort of closed system. I know the world, I understand the world, it is as I know it, and you are who I know you are. Having what I call a hermeneutic of openness, right? Being open to the world around us rather than having a closed system, being able to be open to the things around us, the people around us, being able to disclose who they are on a moment by moment basis, and being open to what they reveal to us about them, rather than having a closed system that I know you and I know what this world is all about, right? This sort of perpetual openness, this sort of softness, and even a softness to ourselves, rather than being predetermined, knowing who oneself is all about and what oneself is all about, being open to sort of Buddhahood awakening within us and revealing new stuff about our own potential as baby Buddhas. Okay? So it's said that even the ideal of that all the world is empty of the attributes we characterize them as, but even the emptiness itself is empty, right? So there's a push against holding too firmly even to this doctrine. Rather, as we've mentioned before, these are more helpful guidelines and hints to have a protective consciousness towards the world for one's own self-development and encouraging the spiritual development of others. Finally, in their ethical system and their ethical values, whereas Theravada Buddhism most essentially emphasizes the four Brahma Viharas, or the four sublime abodes, or four sublime attitudes: loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and empathetic joy. In Mahayana Buddhism, there's a longer list of 10 perfections called Paramitas, in which one emphasizes as developing in this life: generosity, morality, and generally renunciation, okay, so being detached, transcendental wisdom, right, real deep insightful wisdom, energy and diligent effort in one's aspirations and spiritual goals, patience and forbearance towards the wrong done to you, or just situations and circumstances that might not be to your best liking, truthfulness, determination, loving kindness, and serene equanimity. So some overlap with the four Brahma Viharas, these especially, but some different ones as well. So the second metaphysical concept is Buddha nature, often called the Trikaya or Trikaya Garbha, the three bodies of the Buddha. So according to this Mahayana doctrine, the nature of reality is potential Buddhahood itself. Okay? And there's a formless enlightened wisdom, or the Buddha, which pervades all of the universe all at once. Okay? It's a formless enlightened wisdom that pervades all the universe. This is the central reality of the universe, as far as we can say. But taking this overly seriously can be dangerous too, because of this doctrine of sunyata, or emptiness or openness. Okay? The second body of the Buddha is that of the body of bliss, which communicates the Dharma. This is sort of the celestial Buddhist reality, a subtle body, not a hard and fixed body, but a body that which can take on many different forms at different times, and teach and communicate to the bodhisattvas and to other beings the teachings of Buddhism at different times and different places. However, sometimes the Buddha also has this third body, okay, manifesting itself in visible forms, such as in this world as Siddhartha Gautama, to help liberate all beings and teach other beings the Buddhist teachings, to make it very clear and explicit through being able to articulate it out loud with a regular voice in this world. Okay, so this is the third body of the Buddha. Okay, so this is the nature of reality in a way. So even though we looked at the original teaching of the man who's struck with an arrow, but wants to know about who shot it and from what caste they are, right? And the Buddha teaches that such speculation on metaphysics is actually not helpful towards just leading the path that liberates one. Nonetheless, a great deal of metaphysical speculation ensues and takes place within Mahayana Buddhism, trying to understand the structure and nature of reality itself. It's contemplation upon what this thing is, in a way. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha says that, "O monks, there is an unborn, undying, unchanging, uncreated. If it were not so, there'd be no point to life or to training." Okay, what is this unborn, undying, unchanging, uncreated thing? Sometimes it's referred to as nirvana. Some in this doctrine became developed as the Buddha nature itself, or the three bodies of the Buddha. Okay, this is the goal of attainment for all Mahayana Buddhists, and for Buddhists in general, nirvana, which is this supreme state of peace and enlightenment that we can all potentially accomplish.